My name is Naomi Reyes, and I am, as of 14 months ago, the controlling shareholder of a mid-sized asset management firm called Halloway Grant Partners, the same firm that, 11 years ago, offered a 20-year-old college junior an internship and then rescinded it after a phone call from her mother. I want to start with the phone call because it's the hinge of everything, but I want to be honest that the version I'm about to tell you isn't a revenge story in the way these stories usually get packaged. I didn't spend a decade plotting to buy the company that wronged me. I spent a decade building a career, and the buyout was a business decision that happened to intersect with a violence I still haven't fully processed, with the worst afternoon of my early adult life. That intersection is the whole story. I just need you to understand the shape of it before I explain how it happened. I grew up the older of two daughters in a suburb outside Sacramento, in a household where my mother, Elaine, had very specific and very rigid ideas about fairness, ideas that, over the years, I came to understand were less about fairness and more about equilibrium. My mother grew up the middle of 5 children in a house with almost no money, and the 2 siblings on either side of her, older and younger, got what she has described to me more than once as all the attention because middle children get invisible. She has spent my entire life, I believe now, trying to make sure neither of her own 2 daughters ever felt what she felt, except she didn't know how to do that by giving us both enough. She only knew how to do it by taking from one to give to the other, alternating, so that the scales never tipped too far in one direction for too long. When I was younger, it was small things, a bigger birthday party for my sister Vanessa one year, mine scaled back so it doesn't feel unfair, and then the reverse the following year. I want to be clear that I didn't understand any of this as a coherent pattern until I was well into my 20s. As a child, it just felt like inconsistency. As an adult, looking back, it reads like a woman terrified of repeating her own childhood and repeating it anyway, in a different shape. Vanessa is 2 years younger than me, and I want to say clearly, because it matters to how this story ends, I don't think Vanessa asked her mother to do what she did. I think Vanessa was 22, about to graduate, anxious about her job prospects in a way I recognized because I'd felt it myself the year before, and I think our mother saw that anxiety and did what she had always done, which was intervene on Vanessa's behalf without telling either of us until it was already done. Here's what happened. I was a junior at UC Davis, Finance and Economics, and I had spent the better part of that year applying to summer internship programs the way every ambitious finance student does. Dozens of applications, first-round interviews that went nowhere, a few second rounds that also went nowhere. Halloway Grant Partners was, at the time, a well-regarded but not enormous regional asset manager, and their summer analyst program was competitive enough that when I got the offer call in April, I sat on my dorm room floor and cried. The good kind of crying, the kind where you finally let go of 8 months of held breath. I called my parents that night. My mother congratulated me. I remember the congratulations sounding, in hindsight, slightly thin, though at the time I didn't notice it. 3 weeks later, I was home for a weekend, and my mother sat me and my father down at the kitchen table, Vanessa conspicuously absent, which I understand now was deliberate, and told me, with an expression I can only describe as pride, that she had called Halloway Grant's HR director directly. I spoke to their HR director and explained your sister was the better fit, she said. They were very understanding. I remember the room going very quiet in my ears, the way sound does right before you understand something enormous. My father, sitting beside her, added, in the tone of a man closing an argument he believed had already been settled fairly, "It's a competitive firm. She needs the head start more than you do." I want to describe what the better fit actually meant because I've turned this phrase over more times than I can count. Vanessa had no finance background. She was a communications major who had, as far as I knew, never once expressed interest in asset management before that spring. What my mother meant by better fit was not that Vanessa was qualified. It was that Vanessa was, in my mother's calculus, more fragile, further behind, more in need of an intervention, and I was, by the same calculus, sturdy enough to absorb the loss. I had gotten one good thing. The scales needed to tip back. I picked my bag off the floor by the table and left the house for a walk. I did not come back for 3 days. I want to be honest about those 3 days because they are, I think, the truest vulnerability in this story, truer than anything that happened 7 years later in a boardroom. I drove to my college roommate Priya's apartment in Davis, an hour and a half away, arrived unannounced at nearly 11 at night, and did not, for the first several hours, say a coherent sentence about why I was there. Priya let me sleep on her couch without asking questions the first night. The second day, I mostly didn't eat, which I recognize now, with the distance of a decade, as a physical symptom of something my 20-year-old self had no vocabulary for, a kind of grief that had nowhere else to go, because grieving an internship sounds absurd out loud, and grieving your mother's demonstrated belief that your accomplishments were fungible, reallocable, someone else's if someone else needed them more, doesn't have a name people recognize as legitimate. On the third day, Priya finally sat across from me at her kitchen table and asked, gently, what I was going to do. Not what had happened, she already knew that. What I was going to do. I called Halloway Grant's HR line myself that afternoon, not to fight for the internship. I understood by then that the offer had already been formally withdrawn and reassigned, and Vanessa was, apparently, being onboarded, but because I needed, for my own sake, to hear from someone at that company directly what had actually been said. The HR coordinator I reached, a woman named Deb who I would encounter again, unrecognizably, 7 years later, was clearly uncomfortable and wouldn't give me much beyond confirming that a family member had called to advocate for a change in the offered candidate, and that the firm, not wanting to involve itself in what appeared to be a private family matter, had accommodated the request. I remember thinking, even at 20, that this was an insane sentence for a professional company to have acted on. I also remember understanding, with a clarity that has never left me, that I could not build my adult life around being angry at a company that had simply made an easy, cowardly decision when a parent called. The company hadn't betrayed me. My mother had. The company had just been the room where it happened. I went back to campus career services the following week and, with the help of an advisor named Mr. Okafor, who spent 4 unpaid hours with me going through his personal contact list, landed a different summer analyst position, smaller, less prestigious, at a firm called Redcastle Capital that nobody outside the industry had heard of. I want to say plainly that I did not take that job planning revenge. I took it because it was the job available to me, and because Mr. Okafor told me something that reorganized how I thought about the entire situation. The firm you don't get into rarely matters as much as what you do at the firm that takes you. I didn't fully believe him, at 20. I believe him completely now. I stayed at Redcastle for 6 years after graduation, working my way from analyst to associate to, eventually, a junior portfolio manager role, under a boss named Marcus Webb, who became, over those years, something closer to family than my actual family had felt like in a long time. Marcus was blunt, occasionally cutting, and completely without patience for excuses, and also the first professional mentor who ever told me, flatly, that my read on distressed small-cap equities was better than his, which he said not as encouragement but as a simple statement of fact, the kind of compliment that lands harder, because it isn't trying to make you feel good. Under Marcus, I built a specialty in underperforming asset managers, firms with good books of business and bad operational discipline, the kind of company that looks troubled on paper but is actually one competent restructuring away from being valuable. It was unglamorous, patient work, the opposite of the flashy deal-making people imagine when they picture finance, and I was very good at it. I need to talk about the rest of my life during these years because it existed, fully, apart from any of this. I got married at 28 to a man named Julian, a labor attorney I met through Priya, who remains, 15 years after that terrible weekend on her couch, one of my closest friends and the maid of honor at my wedding. Julian and I have a 6-year-old daughter, Mira, who is, at this exact moment in her life, obsessed with tide pools and has informed me on more than one occasion that she intends to be a marine biologist, an oceanographer, and the boss of a submarine. All 3, simultaneously. I run a small book club with 3 women from my building that has, over 4 years, evolved into something closer to a support group that occasionally discusses books. I still talk to Mr. Okafor twice a year, an email exchange that has outlasted my entire undergraduate experience by a decade. None of this life was built in service of some eventual reckoning with Halloway Grant Partners. I want that understood, clearly. I built a life. The company simply reappeared inside it, years later, the way old wounds sometimes do, not summoned, just resurfacing. The reappearance happened because of my job, not because of my history. For years ago, Redcastle's parent fund began evaluating a series of acquisition targets in the regional asset management space, firms with solid client books but aging leadership and operational drag, exactly my specialty. Halloway Grant Partners came across my desk as a potential target in the second year of that process, flagged not by me, but by a junior analyst on my own team who had no idea of my history with the firm and simply saw a company matching our acquisition thesis. Strong AUM, weak succession planning, a founder nearing retirement with no clear internal successor. I remember sitting with the target list for a full minute before I said anything, feeling something strange and cold settle into my chest, not triumph, something closer to vertigo. I disclosed the conflict immediately to Marcus and to our fund's compliance officer, laying out the full history, the internship, my mother's phone call, all 11 years of it. I want to note because I think it says something true about how these processes actually work, that nobody suggested I recuse myself. Marcus's response was simply, "You know this company's operational weaknesses better than anyone on the team because you've apparently been thinking about them, whether you meant to or not, for over a decade. That's not a conflict. That's diligence." I led the deal team over the following 18 months, and I want to be honest that most of that time had nothing to do with emotion at all. It was spreadsheets, client retention modeling, personnel cost analysis, 3 trips to Halloway Grant's offices for management meetings where I sat across a conference table from executives who had no idea, none, that I had once been a 20-year-old whose offer letter they had rescinded on a phone call. The deal closed 14 months ago. I became, through Redcastle's fund, the controlling shareholder of Halloway Grant Partners. I did not go looking for Vanessa's file. I want to be completely clear about this, because I think it's the detail that makes this story true rather than tidy. Standard post-acquisition integration involves, among an enormous amount of paperwork, a full personnel audit. Every employee, current and former, reviewed for compliance exposure before a firm folds its HR systems into the parent companies. I was reviewing the first stack of historical personnel files myself, at nearly 10 at night, 3 weeks after the deal closed, mostly because I hadn't been able to sleep and had decided working was better than lying awake, when I opened a file with my sister's name on it. Naomi Reyes. Hired as a summer analyst 11 years ago. Converted to a full-time analyst role the following year. Terminated for cause in her second full year, for what the file described, in the careful, bloodless language HR department's use, as repeated failure to meet performance benchmarks despite documented coaching and a formal improvement plan. There was a termination letter. There was an exit interview summary noting that Vanessa had, in her own words during the exit process, described the role as not really what I wanted to do and expressed that she'd taken the position because it was available, language that read, to me, sitting alone in that office at 10 at night, like an echo of a sentence I had never actually said out loud to anyone but had thought constantly for 11 years. This was never even something she wanted. I sat with that file for a long time. I want to describe what I felt because it wasn't vindication, and I think vindication is what the internet wants this moment to be. What I actually felt was a strange, heavy grief for the 20-year-old me who had lost something she had earned and wanted badly, and unexpectedly for Vanessa too, who had been handed something she never asked for and then blamed, formally, in an HR file, for not wanting it enough to succeed at it. My mother's intervention hadn't actually helped Vanessa. It had set her up in a role she had no investment in, at a firm she had no real path into on her own merits, and then let her fail there, publicly, on a permanent record, while I had gone on to build exactly the kind of career our mother had accidentally tried to hand her. 2 days later, Halloway Grant's HR director, the same Deb from 11 years earlier, older now, still working in the same department, completely unaware that the new controlling shareholder reviewing personnel files was the woman she'd once spoken to on the phone, came to me as part of a routine integration meeting and mentioned, almost as an aside, that there was a former analyst in the terminated for cause file, Naomi Reyes, whose sister had, coincidentally, once also been connected to the firm. Deb had apparently pulled the older internship correspondence out of some vague instinct of thoroughness and asked, entirely without irony, entirely without any idea what she was actually asking, whether I wanted to consider her for rehire given a current opening on the client services team. I opened the file again, right there in front of her, and read the termination language one more time before I answered. I said no. Not out of cruelty, and I want that understood clearly because I've turned this decision over more than any other decision in this entire process. I said no because Vanessa had never wanted this industry, had been placed in it by someone else's need to correct a scale that had never needed correcting, had failed in it publicly and painfully, and rehiring her now, by me of all people in the specific position I now held, would have been its own kind of cruelty, a repetition of the same pattern that had broken both of us in different directions 11 years earlier, a woman deciding, on someone else's behalf, what that person needed, instead of asking her. I called Vanessa myself that night for the first time in almost 2 years. We had drifted, not through any dramatic rupture, just the slow erosion that happens between siblings who were never given the chance to have an honest relationship with each other before our mother's decisions got tangled permanently into the middle of it. And I told her the truth. I told her I now owned the company that had once fired her, that HR had floated the idea of bringing her back, and that I'd said no, and I told her exactly why. Not because I didn't think she deserved a second chance somewhere, but because I didn't think this, of all places, was actually hers to want. There was a long silence on the phone. And then Vanessa said something I hadn't expected, something that has stayed with me since. I never wanted that internship, Naomi. I took it because Mom told me I'd finally caught up to you, and I didn't know how to say no to that. That conversation didn't fix anything between us in the way these stories usually promise resolution happens. Vanessa and I talk more now than we did before, cautiously, carefully, two adults slowly learning to have a relationship that isn't mediated through our mother's need for balance. But it's fragile. We haven't talked about the internship directly since that phone call. I don't know if we ever fully will. I called my mother separately, a few days later, mostly because I needed her to hear it from me before she heard it secondhand, the way information in my family has always traveled. I told her about the acquisition, about finding Vanessa's file, about the rehire question, and my answer. I expected anger, or defensiveness, or the specific kind of deflection my mother has always been skilled at. What I got instead was quiet, and then, after a long pause, something close to an apology, not a clean one, not the kind that names the thing directly, but her version of it. I thought I was helping her. I didn't think about what it would take from you. I don't think my mother has ever, in her life, been able to hold two of her daughter's needs in her mind at the same time without one of them collapsing into the other. I don't think that's going to change now, at 61 years old, because I finally own the company where it happened 11 years ago. Some patterns are older than any single decision could undo. I want to be honest about what I actually have now and what it cost. I have controlling ownership of a firm with a genuinely strong client book and, under new leadership, a real path to growth over the next decade, a professional achievement I am, without complication, proud of. I have Julian and Mira and her submarine ambitions and Priya, still, after 15 years, and Marcus, who still calls me twice a month just to argue about market conditions because he misses managing me. I have a fragile, tentative, real relationship with my sister that didn't exist a year ago and might, slowly, become something sturdier. What I don't have, and never will, is the version of that spring 11 years ago where I simply got to keep what I'd earned without anyone deciding, on my behalf, that someone else needed it more. I don't have a mother who can hold both her daughters as whole, separate people rather than counterweights on a scale she's been trying to balance since she was a child herself. The buyout gave me the company. It didn't give me that afternoon back, and there is no controlling stake large enough to purchase it. I still have the offer letter from 11 years ago, the original one, the one that got rescinded. I found it in a box of college papers a few years back and never threw it away. I don't know why I kept it. I think, some nights, I keep it the same way I imagine my mother keeps whatever memory she has of being the invisible middle child in a house with no money. Not because it's useful, but because some losses just stay in the drawer, filed, permanent, quietly shaping everything that gets built around them.